think justice plays a central role, actually, in what's going on in Sudan, partly because where we find ourselves today, post-coup and in the midst of a war, is directly linked to the impunity that the belligerents have enjoyed over the past few years. And so when we think about how we get ourselves out of this conflict, justice and accountability has to be central to how we conceive of ways of ending this conflict. That means that the belligerents cannot, as they have done before, simply get away with waging this war and reconfigure themselves politically in another sort of government or political dispensation. They have to face some form of justice. Now, right now, the two belligerents are seeing any kinds of concessions as a loss. I think we need to flip that around and sort of posit the fact that accountability will come as an opportunity for them. You know, we may not get everything we want in terms of justice, we may not get everything we want in terms of compensation, but if some, of what they want to keep, their troops, their money, can be somehow leveraged to get some kind of accountability, particularly for groups that haven't had any accountability so far, that is a potential avenue if victims' rights groups agree to it. Now, what we've seen before is that victims' families have, to some degree, been communicating that they are willing to forego some, justice dispensation. So, for example, the death penalty or serious jail time for some of the belligerents in return for knowing where their family members are buried, knowing what happened to them, what became of them, and in some cases also using customary laws to bring about financial recompense or other kinds of compensation. Now, the formula for that will need to be worked out with victims' families. They will need to be central to figuring out how exactly to do this. But the key thing to get the generals to even sort of consider laying down their weapons is for them to see including justice as an opportunity rather than a major concession, and therefore being unprepared to discuss it. Well, as you know, Sudan has a very long history of peace agreements and political agreements, and all of those have, to a large degree, completely ignored justice. They've completely ignored underrepresented groups, be they women, young people, or people from ethnic minorities. This time around, we have to ensure that as wide a proportion as possible of Sudan's population and people who have been directly affected by this war are engaged in the terms of those agreements. Now, so far what we've seen from the Jeddah talks, as well as some of the IGAD talks, and now most recently the Cairo talks, is that they have been almost entirely missing the civilian element. And where they have included some civilians, these have been the elites that have been engaged in these processes before, and whose inclusion has not exactly brought about the kind of dividends that most Sudanese people want to see. You mentioned that the Jeddah talks were suspended. There's now been hints from different political actors in Sudan and outside of it that there is a reconsideration of that. So we may see the sort of Jeddah 2.0 in the next month or so. And if that's the case, then it has to make sure that the behaviors and the modality of the talks and the approach to the talks that we saw last time are now dismissed and a new modality takes shape. This means that, again, civilian voices, as broad as possible, have to be included, and the Jeddah talks cannot stand in isolation. They must engage with other talks that are going on, be they the IGAD talks or the Cairo talks. Now, most recently, as of yesterday, we saw Kenya's President Ruto and Egypt's President Sisi sit down together and put out some communications that indicate that they are to some degree on the same page regarding Sudan. Now, that is a very positive development, but we can't take it for granted. What we will need to see is concrete mechanisms for them to engage, including also with the Jeddah talks, should they take shape, and then also for them to use whatever leverage they have, bearing in mind they will have different leverage, to discuss different elements of this. So whether that being ceasefire, humanitarian engagement, or political engagement. Those are yet to be figured out, but central to all of those approaches has to be justice and has to be maximum civilian engagement, two of the things that were missing from previous talks. So it's important to remember that civilians are playing a role. What we've seen is that the same groupings, the same organizations, be they resistance committees or unions, that have been playing very formative roles since the even before the fall of Omar al-Bashir, are now yet again playing absolutely pivotal roles on the ground. So we're seeing the main humanitarian response actually emanate from resistance committees, from doctors' unions. We've seen journalists ensure that in a very polarized political landscape, that the truth, to the fullest extent possible, is able to come out. We've seen human rights monitors make sure that they gather and collect and document as much as possible information that may be later useful in judicial processes. And so they are very much active. The question is, can the international community tap into what's already taking place on the ground? And the answer is that they have to, because without the very people on the ground that are leading both the humanitarian response and to some degree also the political response, then we're not going to see any kind of lasting or even indeed relevant agreement come out of any of the talks. Now, your question is very important because it highlights the fact that previously civic actors, particularly those from resistance committees, unions, etc., have largely been cast aside in these mostly state-based processes. And this time around, it will be criminal, frankly, to sidestep them because of the work that they're doing. But also it would mean that whatever comes out, whatever agreement, whatever setup comes out, won't be sustainable unless you have these very political, very energized, very active groups engaged as well. Absolutely. And, you know, what we've seen is that people who were against the Sudan armed forces when they committed the coup in October 2021 have now slightly altered their preference by siding with the Sudan armed forces because they perceive a larger enemy, and that larger enemy is the rapid support forces. Now, there's a sequencing issue here at play. So it's not that the Sudan armed forces can necessarily parlay that newly found ephemeral legitimacy into future political legitimacy. It's just that for most people in Sudan, they see the RSF as the primary threat, followed then by the Islamists. Now, there are also, on the other side, some, has to be said, mostly political and some business elites that see the Islamists as the greater threat and the RSF second. Now, this automatically means that we can't get as much consensus as we'd like to, but this polarization is intentional. You know, this war is being fought also on a sort of social media front, and there are many bots and trolls that have been identified that keep this polarization active, and this polarization is designed to split Sudanese public opinion so that the war can keep going, because at the end of it, both sides, both the Sudan armed forces and the rapid support forces, for the meanwhile at least, believe they can achieve a military victory. And until such time, they need civilians to back them one way or the other, rather than come together and back a no to war campaign that would also guarantee that neither one can play a role in future politics. So this hedging between the belligerents is really what's driving the polarization and keeping the war going. I wouldn't say it's a civil war all across the country. Now, what we've been seeing in Darfur, for example, where you have civilians picking up arms to defend themselves or indeed to perpetrate crimes, that is much more of a sort of civil war characteristics. But there, the conflict is also embedded in, the previous iterations of conflict that we've seen, certainly over the past 20 years, that have yet to be resolved. So we're seeing some tribal groups and some militias settling old scores that they feel they haven't achieved or had any kind of political results that they are happy with at the expense of other groups. And really this comes down to the same sort of political dynamics we were seeing before, over resources, over land, taking an ethnicized dimension, and really then that being the thing that drives the violence. Whereas in Khartoum, we're still largely seeing a case of two militaries or two armies coming into confrontation with each other in a civilian setting, and where we have seen some iterations of civilians picking up arms, either buying arms or using arms they already had. It's mostly to defend themselves rather than to fight one or the other of the belligerents. So we're seeing a patchwork of different conflict dynamics across the country. And we shouldn't forget also that South Kordofan and Blue Nile are also experiencing iterations of conflict. They are also linked to unresolved conflicts that have taken place over the past decades in those parts of the country. And in many ways, it seems then that this war has been used by some of these groups, some of these militias, some of these armed groups, as a way to not just settle old scores, but also eke out some level of sort of political opportunities for themselves, which means that, really this is a conflict that can engulf the entire country soon enough. And so when we think about the urgency of sort of a political settlement or a peace settlement, one, it has to be rooted in justice, but two, it has to look at the whole country, not just the really active war zones. So, of course, sort of coming at the tail end of a process that was meant to reverse the coup, or at least undo some of the political consequences and economic consequences of the coup. This war, the timing of this war is directly linked to that process. We saw a political process that had very little on the ground legitimacy, but was being pushed mostly from the outside by international actors who really believed that a political process or political agreement would be signed in April of this year. And of course, that same process, that same pressure cooker that the belligerents were put under, eventually led to the match that sort of lit this conflict that we currently have. But I think, the responsibility for this conflict lies primarily with Burhan and Hemedti, and it is they who have for several years been competing with each other in ways of how to inherit the state that they sort of received from Umar al-Bashir. And then after the coup, even though they led the coup together, they had very different visions about how to consolidate that coup. And actually, this is what really started the increase in tensions that saw it culminate into the war. And it's that irreconcilability of those two contrasting visions between Burhan on one side and his followers, and Hemedti on the other side and his followers, that will need to be resolved. It's not just the issues that triggered the conflict, such as the issue of integration or the issue of a hierarchy in a military council. Those are all symptomatic of the broader misunderstanding or the broader contention between the generals that sort of have their foundations in the ways that they have pursued different foreign policies since they took over from Bashir, different income streams since they took over Bashir, and as I said before, different political visions for how they'd want to consolidate a state in Sudan. Now, the difficulty is that neither of them can actually win militarily, and neither of them can consolidate a state. And the quicker they realize that, the quicker we'll all be able to have conversations, serious conversations about what a military-free post-war Sudan looks like, that sees the military reformed and in its barracks, and sees the RSF dissolved and its assets returned to the public, as the resistance committees, as pro-democracy actors have called for. Really, it's the pro-democracy movement. The fact that even this war, which, as you know, many of us who are either working in the space or will have been paying attention, have heard, it's a very ugly war. In many ways, it's a senseless war, because it's a war that, when you sort of look beyond the surface, is just about the ambitions of two opposing camps. And even throughout all of that, and the repercussions of that ugliness, you still have a pro-democracy movement that to a large degree is working independently, that is working with communities, that is remaining relevant and sort of securing the legitimacy that it already had, and responding to people. It's keeping people safe. It's giving people medicine where they need to. It's giving people safe routes. It's giving people access to healthcare. It's giving people access to food. It's helping them to mitigate the effects of the war economy where possible. It's really been the sort of the lifeline for a lot of people, and the social fabric of the country that has been torn asunder by this war, by Burhan and his camp and Hemedti and his camp, is really being woven back together by these pro-democracy forces, and particularly the neighborhood resistance committees. And for me, in this all this ugliness and tendency towards despair, they are the ones who give me the most hope that Sudan can find a path to peaceful and civilian democratic state.